so much for joining us for this really important conversation. I'm incredibly excited about this panel on support, not punishment, ending the criminalization of homelessness. As you know, this has been a topic of conversation for a number of years. There's a pending Supreme Court decision, and so we are very lucky to have national experts here with us. As you could tell, I am not Latrice Walker. The Assemblywoman is en route, but we thought we'll get started and we could just plug her in when she starts. And so I'll just ask our esteemed panel if they could just go down the line and introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be with you guys today. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm Sarah Saadian. I am the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're based in DC, and we advocate for socially and racially just policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes have an accessible, affordable home and communities of their choice. And we're so happy to be here on this panel today with all of my colleagues here, and in part because we really want to focus on the real long-term solutions to homelessness. We all know criminalization is not a solution to homelessness, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about all the work we have ahead to really invest in housing at the scale that's needed to end homelessness and housing poverty. So thanks for having me.
So nice. So I'm Ryan. Can you hear me too? Yeah. We're going to keep doing this over and over again. New mics, right? So I'm Ryan with Corporation for Supportive Housing, CSH. We've been founded here in New York, and I have a long history of working here in New York before moving on to national work. So I'm our Vice President, oversees strategy and external affairs, all our policy work. And it's nice to be here in part because when I came to CSH and the work that I used to do, I came to CSH from Women's Prison Association and worked on the FUSE initiative for people that have old brains, which is now the JISH initiative for people that have newer brains, on what does it take to create reentry supportive housing, how do we think about housing and the intersection with justice in a different way, right? So I'm excited to be here and talk to you about opportunities and ways to think about that.
Hey everyone, Eric Tars, his pronouns. I'm the Senior Policy Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, where I have been for the past 18 years, last week. And in that time I've rotated through just about all of our program areas where we are trying to use the power of the law to end and prevent homelessness in America. I come from the human rights perspective. My father was a refugee following World War II and actually had housing that was provided for him. And I have always kind of grown up knowing that I have been very privileged to be born into the existence I have here in the U.S. And so wouldn't want anything less for anyone than I would have wanted for my own father. Who was born into circumstances that he did not choose. At the Law Center, we are working across litigation, policy advocacy, outreach, and education. As we'll talk about more, there is a big Supreme Court case that we've been very involved in and happy to talk more about that. There was not a decision today, is the news of the morning.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Marcy Thompson, and I'm the Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that focuses on policy solutions that are informed by our research, and then we also work with communities around the country to build their capacity on implementing evidence-based approaches and practices. I've been at the Alliance for just over a year, but I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I started out as a case manager and was at HUD for a number of years. I was the desk officer for New York City back in the day. That was a fun time. But I think the biggest, I see some giggles out there. But I will say one of the biggest things that I've learned throughout my career is just how important it is that any policy discussions that we're involved in, that we're working directly with the providers that are doing the work and with the folks that are that are in our systems that are experiencing homelessness, and that we are really just the facilitators of the process to develop policy. We're not the experts. And so excited to be here today with my colleagues. We see each other a lot on Zoom, so it's nice to be in person today.
Thank you, my esteemed colleagues, and I hope you can hear me. I'm Donald Whitehead. I'm the Executive Director for the National Coalition for the Homeless. The National Coalition is the oldest advocacy group that works directly with people experiencing homelessness. So we hold as our first principle of practice that homeless people should be involved in every level of our work. We actually were founded here in New York as well. We were a project of the New York Coalition for the Homeless. Our initial work was around making sure that there was a right to shelter in New York. Since that time, we've moved to Washington, D.C. Again, our work is really centered in making sure that both we work to end homelessness, but also the immediate needs of people experiencing homelessness are addressed. So our claims to fame are we helped draft the McKinney-Vento Act. We also helped draft the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act. We helped to organize the March on Washington that resulted in the Cranston-Gonzalez Act, and I could go through many more pieces of legislation, but we've been in the fight for a long time, working hard to hold true to our principle that people experiencing homelessness should be at the forefront of everything we do. So we organize, we help to create policy. We also equip people directly to be involved and to have their voices heard in policy, in HUD work. We do a lot of technical assistance. We also have a speakers bureau that we hope changes the narrative about who's homeless. So those are, that's a little bit about NCH. I've been doing work around homelessness and poverty for over 30 years. I started in the environmental movement, became an outreach coordinator, and have had pretty much every position along the way. Since then, I've been a director of shelters, I've run permanent supportive housing programs, and I've also worked in the advocacy world. Wear a couple of other hats I think that are maybe important to today's discussion. I am an advisor to the Secretary of VA on homeless veterans, and also own a company called Racial Equity Partners. So thank you, and I'm really excited to be here today.
As are we. I told you we have an expert panel, and I don't think I knew that origin story, and so that's really helpful to know. But as you could see, there's a lot of roots here in New York, so this feels somewhat like a homecoming. And so I'm going to play moderator for a little bit and start off with some questions. And I'll start with you, Eric. If you could just, and anyone else could chime in, right? When we talk about criminalization of homelessness, could you just expand on, how harmful that is to unhoused individuals as well as the individuals that are trying to help them and the community at large?
Yeah, so criminalization of homelessness, we like to say, is a really expensive way to make homelessness worse. And it's because it creates harms not just for the individual, but for the whole community as well. And so we see this for the individual, just the constant harassment and the feeling of insecurity that people face, the trauma of living on the streets and being threatened with arrest or citation for just existing. In many communities, it is a crime to sleep, to sit, to eat, to go to the bathroom. All these activities that you and I do every day in the security of our own home and are perfectly legal, but become potential criminal acts if people conduct them in public spaces, even in the absence of any place to do them. And that's what's at stake at the Supreme Court today. And so you've got that initial trauma, and then you've got the fines, the fees, the arrest records that are just going to be a barrier to people getting out of homelessness. We've had stories of people who had actually gotten their HUD vouchers, got into an apartment, but because their payments, and they were working, but their payment calculations didn't take into account the garnishment of their wages from all of the tickets that they'd accrued while living outside. They were in danger of not being able to make their rent and losing their housing, losing the voucher that they worked so hard to get because of all of this, the crime of being homeless is almost going to make them homeless again. And all of the investment in those individuals and getting them into housing would have then just been thrown away. And we do this time and again. And then, of course, people who are going into, who are arrested, going into incarceration, it's one of the worst places for anybody to be, but particularly for people who are living with multiple intersecting vulnerable identities, race, gender identities, disabilities, which are often aggravated by being incarcerated. And so there's all those individual harms that can last with you. The collateral consequences can last ongoing. In Tennessee, it's a crime anywhere in the state's a felony, which also disenfranchises you. So, for just sleeping outside, for not having a home, you could lose your right to vote in perpetuity. The community harm is really that we are misusing our resources on a public safety approach that does not create public safety. It does not actually make the community members any safer. We're taking those resources that could be going to housing people, to supportive services, and instead we're spending it on law enforcement, and we're actually prolonging people's homelessness, putting law enforcement into situations that often they don't want to be in, that they aren't trained for adequately. And when you are approaching somebody with a gun on your hip, telling them that you're going to take away their source of survival, their tent or whatnot, that's going to put them into a state of agitation, and you're setting law enforcement up for the next viral video incident. And then, there's often that harm, police violence that can occur, and in some communities, we'll talk a little bit more about, they're setting people up for vigilante violence. When you have the kind of tacit permission of the government saying that these people are criminals, they're other, it allows people to take vigilante acts against them. And in Kentucky, they just passed a state law that adds a person camping on your property to the grounds for invoking your stand your ground privilege, so you can use force to push that person off your land. If you feel threatened in any way by them, you can use deadly force against them. So this is the kind of cascading, increasing set of harms that can be invoked through the criminalization of homelessness.
Really comprehensive view. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add on, but really, the compounding and cyclical implications of this bad policy.
I would just add one additional thing. Two things. It absolutely dehumanizes this population that's already marginalized. And what we've seen is it also puts people in isolated situations where they're more susceptible to violence. So we've seen over 1,900 acts of violence over the last 20 years, half of them fatal, simply because people were homeless. And many times it's when people are in isolated situations. It also does destroy the connection with the people who are charged with taking care of people in those situations, outreach workers and case managers. It dissolves those relationships. It reduces the trust in both those service providers and law enforcement, and leads to outcomes that are not the outcomes that we would want people to enter into. So don't want us to forget that the ultimate failure of the system and the ultimate consequences, some people die because they've been criminalized and dehumanized.
Right. Thank you for that finer point on that. Absolutely. And Sarah, this question's for you. And so we understand that, housing is ultimately the solution, full stop, right? What are the long-term solutions needed to end America's housing crisis?
Yeah, thanks for that. When we at the Coalition think about the driving forces of the housing crisis, we think about 4 main areas, and each of them need their own solution at the scale that's really needed to address the full crisis. So we think about bridging the gap between wages or incomes and housing costs. And in New York State, you need $40 an hour if you're working full-time to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. In New York City, it's even higher. You would need to earn $47 an hour or more than three minimum wage jobs. But this is not just about individual people and their choice about where to work or who to work for. This is a systemic issue where people are just not getting paid enough to afford housing. If you look at the 20 largest occupations in the U.S., 14 don't pay enough to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, right? These are truck drivers, folks who work in retail, nursing assistants, the people who are the engines of our society and our economy, who are continually falling behind on rent and facing eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. So we're working for things like universal rental assistance for everyone who needs it, but also other sort of innovative approaches like a fully refundable renter's tax credit that puts money into the hands of renters that they can use on housing and their other needs. The second solution we focus on is more housing supply. I think we hear a lot about that, but there's a lot of misunderstandings about exactly what type of supply we need the most. And we need housing that's affordable to people with the very lowest incomes. And the reason why that housing doesn't get built is because there's a market failure, right? It doesn't get built because it doesn't make a lot of sense for developers to build it. They would lose money, they would go out of business. The only way that housing gets built is if there are public subsidies. But we don't have enough of those subsidies, and we misspend our subsidies, honestly. We build housing that's not truly affordable to people who need it. And in New York, there are less than 4 homes that are affordable and available for every 10 extremely low-income renters. It's the only income group where there's an absolute shortage of housing, but continually we see policymakers and others, developers, really not focusing on their needs. The third solution is around prevention, and I think we saw some really great examples come out of the pandemic with emergency rental assistance. Sometimes it's just a couple $100s that could keep somebody in their house stably housed, rather than allowing them to experience an eviction and, in worst cases, homelessness. So there's a lot of good lessons there that we could be creating permanent programs to continue that good work. And then lastly, there's this huge power dynamic between landlords and renters that leave renters at really high risk of housing instability. In most places, landlords can evict somebody for no reason at all. They can evict within 3 days. That's just not enough time for people to find adequate housing and move out. And what happens is they stay with friends, they stay with family, but over time their housing precarity pushes them into homelessness. But none of those solutions are ones I think are surprising to folks in this room. I'm sure you know about all of them. The issue that's really at hand, I see, is this lack of political will. We know how to solve this problem, but we don't know how to really effectively put pressure on policymakers to start investing at the scale that's needed. And that's the place where I think all of us can be learning from one another about what strategies work, what tactics work, how do we build power so that we're putting as much pressure on our elected officials to respond to the crisis at the scale that's needed.
Excellent, absolutely.
Can I add to that? I think agree with everything Sarah said, and I always just want to put a plug in to make sure we're also talking about services. I think sometimes services gets a really bad rap, or we assume that we're only talking about the most intensive types of services and treatment. And at the end of the day, we all of us in this room need different types of supports in our life to make sure that we're able to thrive. And people who are experiencing homelessness are no different. So just don't want to lose sight that increasing funding and availability of those resources as well is really critically important.
If I can, I'd pick up on that if I can too. You're right. So we're in New York, right? And New York is arguably the birthplace of supportive housing. You could split it in different ways, but it's as good an argument as any, right? And supportive housing, we know, is that intersection between this deeply affordable housing that Sarah's talking about and these incredibly important wraparound voluntary support services that can help people maintain their housing and access other resources. Supportive housing was really designed as a workaround for broken systems, right? So we have a lot of systems that have systemic problems, that do not get the supports to people. We have an economy that has systemic issues, that does not give enough resources to people to be able to care for their needs. It creates trauma. It does all these pieces, right? So supportive housing was created to do this workaround and say, like, what would it look like if we could wrap all of these services into a house, into an apartment with somebody to help them be able to stay there, navigate all these challenge-broken systems. I should probably stop talking so we can bring somebody up, and I'll pick up in a sec. Yeah?
Thank you, Rita.
Okay. Hey. Oh, no, wait, I thought this was our, all right, sorry. Come on and grab a seat. My bad. I got confused. I don't know Representative Walker. All right. So,
No, that's good.
All right, so I'll keep going, unless you'd like to try to pinch it.
Right. Thank you.
Authoritative.
There
You did. You had a little thing there. I was like, okay, clearly this person is important. All right, so, and you are, I'm sure. All right, so service is really important. So New York is the birthplace of this stuff, right? And trying to figure out how to pair these pieces together. And it's also the birthplace of some really bad policies at the same time, right? So if you've got long gray hair like me, you remember the Giuliani era, right? You remember, right? Yeah, that should be the reaction. Should be the reaction, right? When we led the nation here in New York in deciding to lock people up because they were homeless, because they had unmet mental health needs, because we underinvested in treatment, we underinvested in critical psychiatric care. We were not dealing with stuff. So we said, you know what? I'm tired of seeing people in public. Let's push them out of the subways. Let's push them out of the public square and put them in jail, right? And that is really what's coming back around now in this conversation that we're having. So we not only know, we have extra tools that we didn't have, 30 years ago. We can say that actually we also know what works better. Yep. One, we know that those policies were bad. Right? And they were demonstrably bad. They weren't just like, oh, maybe they worked, maybe they didn't. They bloated our jails. They bankrupted our systems. They exploded our deficits. They got worse and worse outcomes for the people that they were helping, right? With big air quotes, right? So we know those policies didn't work. We also know that during that period of time, there were great people, including people in this room, that figured out, you know what, we can do better, and did things like starting out the castle, right? Launching out programs like the frequent users of support services enhancement that looked at people in jails and services and said, we could do better. And they evaluated this stuff. And not only did it work out that, in fact, it's probably cheaper than all those bundled emergency services, certainly gets better outcomes and better value when you think about your investment and whether you want to pay, say, $250,000 for a jail bed or $30,000 to $50,000 for a supportive housing bed, right? There's just better options for what we can do. So we know that there are things that work. There are great studies that, like New York, again, it like radiated out. So there's great, Denver did this amazing randomized control trial. All the, evaluation geeks like me and the audience are like, ooh, that's the gold standard. That's what everybody wants. That's what budget offices want to hear. They did it, and they proved that, in fact, Denver could save money while working with the same group of people that we're now talking about whether or not we need to start arresting again and forcing into treatment and models that don't work, that aren't funded, right? So we can do better. We know there's evidence to do better.
Thank you for that. And Marcy, I think my next question is for you. We've seen this uptick in homelessness rise. I think in New York, in the last year, it was about 39% uptick in those who are unhoused, right? What trends are you seeing nationally on homelessness in recent years, and how are you seeing that rise contributing to this rise in criminalization laws?
Yeah, so if we think about the primary data that we consider at the national level as the measure of how we determine how many people are experiencing homelessness, we're using the HUD's point-in-time count, which we know is not perfect, but it does allow us to compare year over year and see what the trends are, right? So we know that in the last year, there was, I think, a 12% increase just in the last year. And so, if you're someone in the general public and doesn't know better, you're going to think, oh, these homeless systems aren't working. And we just are seeing more and more people on the streets. But the reality is that we know that there's a lot of inflow, and that is impacting, I think, homelessness more than anything else. So we know we saw So if this year we had more than 650,000 people experiencing homelessness, 39% of those households were unsheltered, which is the highest number since we've been collecting that data. And if you look at individuals experiencing homelessness, that's, I think, over 50% of those households. As Ryan said, we know what to do. We've seen the trend go the other direction, right? So from in the 2010s, we saw a lot of reductions in homelessness. We saw, I think, a 15% decrease over a period of years. And that trend really started to reverse in 2017, along with housing costs that were going up. Was one of the biggest drivers, as we've already talked about. And so today what we're seeing is not just is it harder to sometimes get folks out of homelessness because getting them back into housing can be difficult. I think in the last National System Performance Measure report from HUD, there were 17,000 people a week who are becoming homeless for the first time. So even while your homeless response systems are housing more and more people, becoming more and more efficient, there is no way to keep up with that inflow. And that's based on like 2022 data, and so that number is probably even higher now. And so as a result of all of this, as communities are seeing more and more people sleeping on the streets, as we see encampments popping up, and not just in major cities, but in rural communities, in the suburbs, it's gaining a lot of attention on a lot of campaigns. This is the thing that politicians are leading with often because it's getting a lot of concern from the community. And unfortunately, that's leading to wanting to embrace these out-of-sight, out-of-mind policies rather than investing in the long-term solutions. So they're prioritizing the needs of the housed folks in the community, the businesses, over the rights of people who are experiencing homelessness. I think one of the greatest examples in my perspective, if you think about the data, to look at this inflow, which again is caused by those systemic issues that Sarah spoke about a few minutes ago, is if you look at veterans data. So the VA set a housing placement goal back in 2022 of housing 38,000 veterans. In January of that year, there were 33,000 veterans experiencing homelessness. So they exceeded their goal and housed 40,000 veterans. So you would think, right, that okay, so they must have made a dent. They had a 7% increase in January of 2023. They then had 35,000 veterans. And, so I think that just gives a really clear example of not being able to keep up with the demand. And unless we're attacking this both from creating more abundant housing in communities at large, while also creating those programs that target, that are for the homelessness response systems, we're never going to see a reverse in the trends.
I'd like to just build on that too. There's the systemic housing system that we're talking about. It's that response from the community, and then I think there's this political element too, where politicians want to be seen as if they're doing something. They want to pretend like they're doing something, even if it doesn't actually result in solving the problem or making a dent. And as we're heading into November, I think that's adding some fuel to the fire as well. And part of our job, I think, as advocates is to clarify for our community members that this is not, it's not just that criminalization isn't a solution, it's also that this is another example of how politicians are trying to play you as a voter. They are trying to swindle you into voting for them, making you think that this is going to solve the problem, when the encampment is going to still be there, a month after the election. It's just going to be on a different corner or on a different park or somewhere else. And I think it's really helpful for people in the community to recognize that this is there's political gamesmanship that's happening here too that we have to address head on.
Oh, really good point. Yeah.
Can I just add?
I think that's really critical for this audience in particular, is this political misdirect that's going on, and that builds on these larger narratives of individual responsibility. In America, we believe that if you work hard, then you get ahead. So if you haven't gotten ahead, it must be your fault that you haven't gotten ahead, not the system's fault. That whole narrative has always been a myth, but in this case, it truly is. And the danger is that when we allow that narrative to persist and grow, it detracts from the funding that's going to go to building the supportive housing that folks in this room are trying to do in the services. And for a long time, it was the National Coalition and the National Homelessness Law Center that were pushing this issue of criminalization, and a lot of other organizations didn't want to touch it. They said, we don't want to talk about those bad things and stopping those bad things. We just want to talk about the solutions. But what we're seeing now is these bills that are being introduced that are explicitly taking funding away from the solutions, the housing first solutions that we know work, and redirecting them to short-term measures, legalized internment camps that are going to that people are going to be forced into under threat of arrest. So it's not just this indirect siphoning off of resources that could be going to housing. It's directly taking the funding away from the things we know work and putting them into things that we know don't work and are going to be harmful. But it allows the politicians to say, look what I'm doing. I'm going to get that encampment off of this corner, and those people will be satisfied, and it'll be new people who are complaining about it on their corner because nothing's actually been solved. But it allows them to get away with this, and I think that's the harm that we need to be trying to prevent.
And I would just also add, thank you for saying that, Eric. That's really kind of the fundamental issue that we're dealing with here, is that criminalization does not solve homelessness. It merely gives the appearance of solving homelessness while making homelessness harder to get out of for the people who are criminalized. And the other thing, we were talking about the numbers. One population that we should really highlight that is also growing is the senior population. Yes. So seniors are becoming homeless at a higher rate than any other population. I think that's incredibly important. The other misinformation, misdirection that you're seeing politicians utilize is that homelessness is an issue of criminality. But we know for sure that it's not a moral issue. It's a structural and systemic failure that's causing people to become homeless. It's not about people with low morals. And it's so important that we don't equate criminalization or crime with homelessness. It's not a crime to be homeless. Absolutely. And most of the crime that we see is people who are victimizing people that are living outside. Yeah. And so that is a really important fundamental issue that we need to make sure that people understand. Yes. And I had another thought, but I forgot what it was. So
I just want to, just one last thought on this trend of political wildness, is something else happened around the same time that we started to see the numbers going up. We saw a real shift in our political discourse as a country. I was at HUD starting under Bush 2 and through all of Obama's term and into the first part of Trump. And for years, you could go into any congressional office and have a conversation about homelessness, and they might disagree on how much funding to invest and whatnot, but it was a really nonpartisan issue. And suddenly the language, Eric talked about narrative, that's really when it started, this real divide and this really ugly narrative of people who are poor, people who are experiencing homelessness are there based on their personal decisions. We had the new HUD secretary coming in who only talked about, pulling yourself up from the bootstraps. And I say this because it has shifted the way that we as policy folks are even able to talk about different issues with different offices, because it has become such a hot ticket item. And, even just talking about housing first is such a trigger word that figuring out how to just say housing and services, like in a way that isn't going to close the door has been, so when we're talking about trends, like that feels like a trend in of itself that has had
That's
a really
important
big
to
impact.
surface. Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I do remember the other thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, go for it. No
It
time
takes
like
a
the
while with
present.
me. The other thing is that we also need to recognize that there is an organized effort to make this a
Yes.
reality. There's an organized effort by millionaires in this country, and billionaires, absolutely, to make sure that communities are criminalizing people experiencing homelessness. That may seem preposterous, but it's what's actually happening right now. Kind of started under the same administration with executive director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness that kind of promoted this ideas, but it's been picked up by billionaires. There are billionaires that I guess they don't have anything else important to do, but their message is to give legislation to communities that force them into criminalizing homelessness. So we have a lot of opposition. None of us here are billionaires. Collectively, we're not billionaires. So we have an uphill battle, and that's why it's so important that individual citizens become a part of the organized effort to make sure that this isn't happening. And I hope I'm not stepping on your message at all, Eric, but there was just research done on what America feels, I guess both of your messages, about the issue of criminalization. And most Americans don't think that it's the right direction. And so we have to capitalize on that. And so along with the 5 things that Sarah talked about, we have to organize. Power concedes nothing without protest. It never has, and it never will. I didn't make that up.
Yes. And let's stick with that theme, right, about organizing advocacy and get proximate, right, and about the folks who are most impacted. And I'm going to go back to you, Donald, and just the role of folks most impacted by the issues who know the solutions. How do they advocate? How do they organize? What is the role for folks who are experiencing homelessness or have in the way to end the criminalization of homelessness?
I'm glad you asked that. That's at the forefront of what we do as an organization. Our goal is to empower people closest to the issue to come up with the solutions. It's already in HUD regulation that you should have someone experiencing homelessness on the board of your organization that's providing services. However, we know that a lot of organizations just check the box. What we're trying to do is equip people so that they can have a role where they can authentically engage in solutions around homelessness. So we do that within HUD. We have a group of people with lived experience providing technical assistance on policy and program development at HUD. We have a program called the Lived Experience Training Academy, and that academy equips people with the basic tools they need to be involved in leadership development. We do a conference every year where we bring people across the country together to share ideas about how they're creating coalitions in their community. And we're also asking people to start advocating with their local elected officials. Because the one thing that's really important to know about these criminalization efforts is their local efforts. There is no national criminalization bill. So that's happening at the state level, at the local level, at the county level. So we need people who have gone through this experience to be involved, and we also need to change the narrative by helping people to tell their story. There's some incredibly accomplished people that have gone through the issue of homelessness and come out on the other side, but you never hear about them. You only hear about the people that are still struggling. And so we need to make sure that people are out in front talking about this issue and helping make decisions about how to solve it. And so that is our goal as an organization. We have the Speakers Bureau, we have our technical assistants, we have our Lived Experience Training Academy, but we also hire people with lived experience. 80% of our staff are people who have had lived experience. So we practice what we preach, but we think everybody who does this work should have somebody at the table who can help with the nuances of this experience. Because it's one thing to read about it or study about it, but having actually experienced it really gives you the keys to how to solve it. So that's what we do, but we're also registering people to vote across the country. So we're nonpartisan, but we're going to all the battleground states.
Yes. And just, I'd like to take,
And let me be clear, just in
Yes,
case. We're going to those states because the margins of victory are very small. And we know that if we empower enough people to vote by registering them in those communities, it could have a profound difference on who gets elected in those communities. So that is our strategy around voting. Our campaign is called "You Don't Need a Home to Vote." We've worked with the Law Center for years on creating manuals. So we have a manual on how you can vote in every state. And this is simple in some communities as you just need an intersection as an address to be able to vote. Other states have made it a lot harder, but we try to make sure that everybody has the rules in their state. And that's how we're empowering people to become part of the solution.
Yes.
We hope to mobilize enough people. We just, at the Supreme Court, when the arguments were underway, we actually organized people from all across the country. We had about 17 people yelling very loudly in front of the Supreme Court so they know that people care about homeless people. We want to do that in as many places as we can. So I think that is the real key. We have to get people involved to share that this is not okay. It's not acceptable that people are being punished for being homeless in the richest country in the world.
Thank you for situating that, Donald. And as I look out in the audience and I see a lot of our tenant advocates and impacted people, you know, just the importance and the power of your mobilization. And speaking of power, I just want to first and just really introduce and thank Assemblymember Walker, who just came in. We know it is really difficult for legislators to find time, and so we really appreciate. And, you know, as an organizer, as an advocate for people's rights, also, you know, has been the engine, Assemblyman Walker, of the bail reform movement here in New York, and the targeting of low-income Black and brown folks by NYPD. We are so thankful for her staunch advocacy, and we're glad that she is able to join us here today as your real moderator. So I will fade to black now. That's the last question I asked him.
Okay. Awesome. So thank you so much, and I apologize for my tardiness. I guess I didn't, Waze doesn't factor in the fact that it takes 30 minutes to go 2 blocks here in New York City. So, but I'm sure, luckily we, sent everything that we needed ahead of time, and so we'll jump right on back into where our awesome sister left off. And Ryan, you're up. We know there are lots of challenges at the federal level. Are there any bright spots?
Thank you, and welcome. And I think, these folks are all way too nice to let you know that I didn't know what you looked like before this, although I love your work. I have to say I'm kind of a fan. And so I introduced somebody else by accident. As Representative Walker had disrupted the panel earlier, stopped talking. So
It's all serendipitous.
So it's nice to be back with you. There are bright spots, right? So I think they're hard to find, right? So I was really hoping when we first started talking about this panel that I might be able to come here and say, one bright spot is that even though there's dysfunction at the federal level, the Democrats and the Republicans pulled it together and they passed a tax credit act, and there's going to mean that there's going to be a lot more units that get funded through affordable housing tax credits in New York City and New York State, because you all are up against your caps on bond issues, right? And that didn't happen, right? Because it broke apart. So it's hard to see those, and they're holding it off for probably next Congress to be able to do more leverage around other tax cuts that are seen as more important, right? By some, right? So there are pieces that aren't positive, right? But there are also great things happening. So I was just on the phone with one of your wonderful representatives here, office just the other day, who's looking at AOC and folks that are looking at introducing a bill around social housing, right? And what does it look like to create an office of social housing that could do things like supportive housing and affordable housing at larger scale, and look at different models, like Mitchell-Lama's, if you're here in New York, kind of limited equity models and different pieces like that, right? To look at how to expand supportive housing using different tools than we've had in the past, right? And creative ways of thinking about doing that. There's also good things that happen, not always, not all the time, right, but good things that happen in the administration with the agencies. So for me, It's complicated, but probably the most exciting thing happening right now is Medicaid efforts, right? To think about what does it look like to leverage Medicaid as a services pool. That's complicated, right? Because Medicaid is never the silver bullet that we want it to be. It's complicated, it's bureaucratic, it's hard to make work, it takes a ton of capacity building to make happen. But I will say, and I will say it again over and over again until people won't listen to me anymore, it is the only horse in the race for scalable services for supportive housing right now. Right? And when we are already in an environment where every one of your programs that run supportive housing are barely making it work, from a services perspective, we cannot leave resources on the table. We have to go after them full force and say, not only does Medicaid need to be used to expand supportive housing, bring new units online, it also needs to be used to shore up the existing supportive housing that's out there and add revenues to those struggling resource models, right? So there's things that are happening there. So there's a great new pilot being done with about 7 states involved that's looking at Medicaid acceleration and innovation to do housing-related services and bring those to scale. You have a new waiver in place, which is tricky, right? But it will take some time to evolve and can be built on and grown from to do new pieces that can bring more resources to the table. So that's one. I have one more, if I can. I'll squeeze in one more. I have like 6 more, but I'll just do one more. Right, which is that I would say that, there are these resources that sometimes we look past from a supportive housing and a housing field. So like Second Chance Act resources, right, are ones that they're popular because they had bipartisan support when they were first passed, and so they keep coming back around. So there were new grants that came out not too long ago that communities can go after, including New York State. Every jurisdiction in the community can go after those resources, actually to do supportive housing and services, to put resources into funding to expand those pieces. But you have to be creative. You have to go after those resources and kind of line around them. At the same time, Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is the group that passes that out from the federal level, right? They have a new partnership that the Council of State Governments is managing through their TA Center. It's called Zero Returns to Homelessness, which is an effort to help state corrections agencies and local corrections agencies make changes that are going to reduce the amount of people that leave incarceration and actually end up on the streets or in a shelter, right? So there are things that are happening there that ties back to Medicaid when you think about things like the brand new-ish, year and a half old Medicaid Reentry Act, which is, if you're in the know around this stuff, that's what is allowing people to turn Medicaid back on for people that are incarcerated and provide seamless transitions using Medicaid funding for people to leave and get reconnected to care when they go. So when we think about people like we're talking about, right, that are bouncing back and forth between systems, that may have unmet mental health needs, a lot of trauma, unmet physical health needs, like serious, severe physical health needs that need to be addressed that are impediments to housing, being able to access those resources. The federal government's working really hard to try to make them more available. It's on you all to help your state see that potential and push them to take full advantage on your behalf.
Awesome. So, it's interesting because one of the things that we've been pushing is to try to get reentry housing sort of as an entity unto itself. Because we know how critically important it is to rehouse individuals, but to watch the supportive housing side sort of battle with the reentry worker, reentry housing side. It just is, it's everyone's fighting for peanuts, if you will, when there should be a justified avenue for resources that are just dealing with that particular group of individuals, such as JISH funding that we know we also have in New York City. And so thank you for bringing that up. I'm not sure if our moderator also mentioned that we just opened a new development in my district called The Rise, which we're working with a number of our partners, including the Osborne Association, on securing the funding. And we're almost about to, we already secured that funding, but we're almost about to open, but we're also doing some other development at the Marcus Garvey Village. And so I have made a note about the second chance funding. So Eric,
Yeah.
what else is going on federally with criminalization?
Well,
That's a heavy question. I don't know if we have a whole lot of time, but
it's been a long, hard slog. but starting in the early 2010s, we started getting some good guidance from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. HUD put in a couple of points into its grant applications for communities on their NOFOs to say what steps they're taking to end the criminalization of homelessness. And that was really important for us. Those points continue through to today. And we have gotten the Department of Justice to finally start looking at criminalization of homelessness in their civil rights investigations. So they just last week issued their findings on the city of Phoenix, which trigger warning if you're looking at it, but it gives tons of really graphic descriptions of what people on the streets are experiencing at the hands of the Phoenix Police Department. So a little weak on the recommendations. They haven't gotten to their actual consent decree yet, and we hope that'll be a little bit stronger. But it really catalogs the violations and names them as constitutional and other statutory violations of people's civil rights in Phoenix. Unfortunately, the U.S. government, we've been kind of talking around this Grants Pass versus Johnson case, which is up at the Supreme Court right now. This is a case from Oregon where individuals in this town, there's literally no low barrier shelter. There's only one gospel rescue mission, and if you are either disabled and can't work their work requirements of 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, or you don't want to attend 2 religious services a day, or you don't want to give up smoking or drinking or anything like that, you can't stay at that shelter. And so for many people there's literally nowhere where they can be once they lose their housing. And the city has blanket bans across the entire city 24/7 that say it's illegal to camp, and camping is defined as little as wrapping a blanket around yourself against the cold. And it's our contention and the contention of the plaintiffs in the case that that is cruel and unusual under the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. This case, a local judge agreed with them, the 9th Circuit agreed with the homeless plaintiffs, but now it's up at the Supreme Court, and we are waiting for a decision from them any day now. And the U.S. government did not show up in the way that we wished they would have. They came in with a brief on the side of neither party. They said many of the right things about the harms of criminalization, and that ultimately they didn't think that this was the right case. And they tried to kind of give the courts a different way out. But they also said some harmful things in this amicus brief and arguing in front of the court, talking about an encampment eviction that took place in McPherson Square in D.C. as the gold standard when we know that it certainly was not. And all this being done from the perspective, there's kind of, they go through all the harms of criminalization, and then there's this line, the U.S. is also the country's largest landholder. And you're kind of like, oh, now I see where this is going. This is what you get when you have a country that was founded literally by and for white landowning men, that's going to protect their interests. And so when it's come down to doing the tougher things, coming in on the right side of this case, stopping their own practices of sweeps by the National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management and other agencies that own public lands and sometimes find people experiencing homelessness on them, they have not done what they've needed to do. And so we are in a tough position because we know that the other guy campaigning for president right now is doing so openly on a platform that calls for internment camps and rounding people up under threat of arrest and forcing them into those camps. So things certainly aren't going to get better. But this administration is not doing what it needs to do to really take a strong stand against criminalization of homelessness. So it's difficult for us as advocates to figure out exactly how to hold this government accountable and get it turned fully into the right direction.
Awesome.
And I would just add, I'm not going to be a cheerleader for the administration, but one other thing that they did that's really important when it comes to returning citizens is Secretary Fudge, and this has been done before, issued guidance that subsidized housing providers, the authorities could not just automatically make ineligible people leaving the criminal justice system. That this had to be done on an individual basis, so that people weren't automatically excluded from subsidized housing. I think that's a really important measure. I don't know how strongly people are abiding by it, but I think it's really, really important. Also, they just issued guidance or comments on guidance last week about how to do a better job of making sure that people leaving the criminal justice system can get into housing. Don't know what happens after that, but they did make those two efforts. Yeah. The other thing that we haven't talked about is the overrepresentation of people of color. And some of the things they've done to address that overrepresentation, I think, are also tied to the overrepresentation of people in the criminal justice system. So they've done a number of things along those lines, including reinstating affirmatively furthering fair housing. So those are two other things that I would.
Awesome. And so, well, one of the things that I'm hearing is that there is a historical connection to a lot of these conversations, which, we had in a very important day yesterday, but it also reminds me of Black codes, right? Yeah. Where we know that slavery was abolished, except in the case of criminal punishment, and then they made it a crime not to have a place to live, and so it sort of recycled, and undid everything that you did 5 minutes ago. But in that regard, we are thankful to the Biden administration for acknowledging Juneteenth and making it a federal holiday. And so in addition to that, as well as the other thoughts around Secretary Fudge, Marcy, can you talk about the Biden administration's efforts and or failures, and feel free to talk about any pertinent legislation? Marcy.
Yes, I can, and I'll try to stay a little bit objective here. I did not mention, I did mention that I was at HUD for a number of years, but I more recently did a brief stint at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. I was actually the primary author of All In, which is the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. And I want to try to keep this brief because I know we have a lot of questions to go. Here is what I'll say. When the plan was published on December 19th, 2022, I'm not bitter or anything, and I said to my boss, I said, this is the only day that we can celebrate this plan. I felt really good about the plan. There was a lot of commitment around leading with equity and making sure that people with lived experience were at every single table where federal policy was being made. And I said, this is the only day we can celebrate this, because going forward, we can only celebrate when we take action on the things that are included in this plan. And since that date, I'm pretty sure that the plan has been on a shelf, and there has not been any concerted effort to implement any of the strategies within that plan. And in fact, some of the actions that the administration have taken have been in contradiction to the things that are in the plan. Eric mentioned, and I'll just speak on this a little bit more briefly, or a little bit more specifically, one of the primary ways, so the plan specifically calls out criminalization as not being good, not being effective. It calls on federal agencies that own federal property to work collaboratively with local partners to make sure that they're not just sweeping encampments when people don't have anywhere else to go. Last year, in early 2023, the National Park Service, who historically has had no camping policy on Park Service land, they had lifted that ban during COVID, and then they were planning to reinstate it. They were planning for a closure of an encampment at McPherson Square, which is a few blocks from the White House. It's across the street from the VA. VA secretary at the time was the U.S. ICH council chair. Right across the street, there were 70 or so folks that were residing there. They were planning to close the encampment in April, and they decided that they wanted to close it in February instead and gave 2 weeks' notice. These lovely folks who are a part of the National Coalition for Housing Justice really rallied and tried really hard to push the administration to step in and not let this go forward until they could identify reasonable options for the folks that were residing there. And at the end of the day, the administration and my boss decided that it was the right thing to do to move forward with the closure and evict the folks that were there. 49 people were displaced with no housing options, and that was really disappointing. Moreover, we were promised that they would evaluate their internal protocols, and at the end of the day, they really haven't. They've been emboldened, and they've come back and are continuing to close down encampments just recently last month. And I say this to say that we need to hold all politicians, all administrations accountable for what they do, and putting out good plans and saying the right thing, but not following it up with action. We have to name that when we see it. So there you go.
Thank you. Right? We have to hold people accountable. So Sarah, let's come back to you and stick with this national perspective. What are the prospects for increased federal funding this year and in 2025? And also, along those lines, how does the upcoming election impact what's possible in Congress next year?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for this year, I'll say we have a challenge on our hands to get increased funding, just like we do in many years. You might remember that last year we were facing a similar prospect where House Republicans refused to lift the debt ceiling unless they got caps on spending for domestic programs, including housing and homelessness programs. A deal was struck. They passed a budget. What's the bright spot is that even though we were facing a potential cut of between 80,000 and 112,000 housing vouchers, we were able to keep all of that funding and expand the program to another 3,000 households. So that's because of all of your advocacy in this room, because of your really effective engagement with Senator Schumer, so keep that up. But we're facing a similar challenge this year. Again, only that budget agreement only allowed a 1% increase in funding, and of course, as we're all seeing rents increase in communities, that means the cost of rental assistance goes up too. So we have to be really on our game this year and continue pushing for funding. We probably won't see a budget until the end of the year after the election, so we have a long time ahead of you. In terms of the prospects for 2025, there's some things that are going to happen no matter what, and then some things that really could be different. So in terms of things that could happen no matter what, we know that there has to be a tax package next year. There's going to be an enormous push for lots of different resources around the child tax credit, earned income tax credit, the low-income housing tax credit. All of those are going to be on the table. The outcome of the election, of course, makes a difference in terms of how successful we can be, what we can get, what does that look like. The larger issue is what does the election mean for us? The difference couldn't be starker. I'm really worried about a Trump administration just based on what we saw last time, right? I am sure they will come back with more attempts to evict mixed status immigrant households from HUD housing. We're going to see attacks on LGBTQ individuals, including allowing shelters to discriminate against transgender individuals. Huge attacks on fair housing. This is a place where the administration had the most leeway just because of how the regulations are set up. And they're going to come after it again around affirmatively furthering fair housing and disparate impact to try to really dismantle our fair housing system. They're going to work to increase rents in HUD housing, put in time limits, work requirements, things that would push people out of being eligible for the housing that they need and leave them without other options. I think what makes it even scarier than last time, not to be the doomsdayer here, but it's important for us to have a very clear-eyed vision of what could happen here. Last time around, it took them about 1.5 years for them. They were new to government. They were outsiders, right, who were coming in. They didn't know how to work the gears of government, and it really took about 1.5 years for them to figure that out, which gave us as advocates time to prepare and organize for how to respond to really harmful policies. This time around, they know how to work the gears of government. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's different is that they have massive plans to lay off career staff and to only put in political appointees who are deeply aligned with them. And the last time around, those were often our saving graces. There were folks in the administration who would share information with outside groups, who would try to slow down the process, would try to steer things in the right direction. But none of the Republican housers I know of want to serve in a Trump administration. And so that means the folks that they're appointing are not going to be the folks who care deeply about housing and homelessness, even if we disagree on policy from time to time. These are going to be much more ideological folks who are in charge. And so all that's to say, I think we need to be thinking now about how we prepare. If that's the case, we need to get out and vote in a nonpartisan way, but we also have to prepare now and organize now, build those relationships now, because that's going to be a muscle that we're going to have to work really from day one. And to, I think Eric raised this earlier, in the final month or so of the Trump administration, the first time around, that's when we started to hear the seeds of bringing together FEMA, Department of Defense, GSA, so they could think about creating these government-sanctioned encampments for people experiencing homelessness. They weren't able to move forward with it because of the election outcome and the change in scene. But I am deeply worried that will be top on the list of things that they would move forward on that we didn't see last time around. And I think all of us have a huge stake in making sure that that doesn't happen.
Awesome.
Can I add one note to that, Rep. Walker? Just a real quick
So
one.
you mean to tell me I can't mention that she reminded me of the party planner who had an encampment on the NYCHA public floor from this previous administration? Talk about a nightmare.
Yeah, no, that's good. That is worth not letting me do that. And you should go on, actually, about it. But the thing I was going to say is that the other thing is that when it took us, because I think honestly 1.5 years is generous. I took it like two plus years. They were particularly slow to figure things out. But that gave us 2 years to slowly figure out how to respond at the state level too, right? So we should be starting to plan proactively now to how to do counteractive measure, not waiting for a Supreme Court decision that says it's okay to put people in jail for being homeless. What does it look like for New York State to say it's not okay to do that here? What does it look like for us to do things that can be on the other side of this stuff in advance?
Wow, okay. Noted.
If only
He's
there
not
was
a
a family member here.
Let me put this one over here.
We're just trying to keep you guys up at night, right? We're trying to instill the fear in you now.
Well, let me tell you, we did learn that as a lesson, with even passing of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, where, Washington wasn't acting, and we recognized how important it was to protect voters, and passed it here in New York State. So we do have a blueprint for getting that type of work done. Marcy, I'm going to come back to you. How are national partners working together to take a stand against the criminalization of homelessness?
I'll say a couple of things, and I welcome my colleagues up here to chime in as well. So I mentioned before the National Coalition for Housing Justice, and I think it's worth mentioning just riffing off the last topic that we were just speaking of, that part of why that group formed was under the last administration, specifically recognizing that, hey, instead of us kind of operating as individual organizations, we really, more than ever before, need to group together and, position ourselves to fight what's ahead. And, so that group is still thriving. I probably talk to these folks more than I do some of my own teammates. And, I think around criminalization in particular, so I mentioned kind of the pushback that that the group, I wasn't a part of it, I was on the other side, unfortunately, but around the DC encampment last year. But from that, as a group, we've continued to keep the pressure on the administration. There's my CEO and a few other leaders of the group are able to meet monthly with the Domestic Policy Council, which is really important because it keeps them informed. Even if nothing else, it keeps them informed, and they know that someone is holding them accountable. So that has been really important. As we've been preparing for the Supreme Court, thanks so much to the leadership of the National Homelessness Law Center, we've really worked together to be as responsive as we can. So in addition to planning a in-person rally on April 22nd when the oral arguments took place, we've also been really busy in the halls of Congress. My colleague John Threlkeld and Sarah and others planned something like 50 meetings with congressional offices in a really short time span just to talk to them about the harm that criminalizing homelessness does, about the case, etc. We're working on a sign-on letter right now for congressional offices to urge President Biden to do whatever he can in the remaining months of this year to take action. We've sent a letter with recommendations to the administration. With not everything requires an act of Congress, y'all. There are decisions that agencies can just make to do something better. And so, we as a collective have worked really hard to bring all of our expertise and the things that we know to push those different pressures. We have different relationships, whether it's been with media or with different agencies. And so how do we pool those relationships and really leverage that as a collective, which hopefully, I think ultimately gives us more power. What else would you all add?
I would add that one of the things that's different, I think at the staff level, we've always had kind of a working relationship. What was new for me in my long time in this work is that the EDs actually got together. And I couldn't remember another time when we had a regular meeting of the people that are charged with making decisions about a effort that we came to together. So not only do we meet as NCHJ, and some leaders make that meeting as well, but all the leaders are meeting at least once a month to really think about collective action. Eric told you that, especially around the issue of criminalization, really our two agencies were kind of at the forefront of that. We worked together for years, and we were kind of isolated a little bit in doing that work, but now everybody has come together. It's hard work because we have to really navigate a message that says we're not endorsing encampments. We don't want people sleeping on the sidewalk or in a park, but the solution to it is not criminalization, and that's a really tough message to navigate.
So how then can I incorporate that into the Pottinger Agreement in Miami?
Sure. So 20 years ago in Miami, there was a case called the Pottinger case, and the Pottinger case made it illegal basically to criminalize it, just to kind of capture it in a short message. It's a really long case. But what it did was...
The lawyer in me is like,
But yeah, I know. And I'll let you, please share as well. But it did reduce criminalization. We can say that very clearly. And when criminalization was reduced in Miami, the number of people that were homeless were reduced. I think by somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90%. Wow. So a wonderful, wise decision was made in 2019 to repeal the Pottinger Agreement. So now the state of Florida and the city of Miami is now criminalizing again, and we've already seen a rise in the number of people that are homeless. So we have clear evidence that there's a better approach, that there's an approach that's going to reduce homelessness overall, and yet we have a governor in the state and a leadership in Miami that has decided that that's not the right way to go. Even in Miami Beach, homelessness is criminalized, but there is not one shelter in Miami Beach. So we see evidence that this does not work, and we have to do something different. But regardless of the evidence in front of them, communities like Miami and Florida as a state have decided that criminalization is the right way to go. And please add the lawyer.
Before he does that, the lawyer in me as well, is very anxious to hear about an 8th Amendment case that involves homelessness and people sitting, sleeping, and lying outside on public property. That's the Johnson versus Grants pass Supreme Court case. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and what could be the impact there?
yeah. So this is the case that I was mentioning earlier. We've been kind of talking around it all day. And yeah, so this is a case that is based on the same line of cases that Pottinger came out of, and then continued into the Martin versus Boise decision, which the fact that the Supreme Court chose not to take that up in 2019 was also one of the reasons that the Trump administration backed off of their plans to try to do a federal push to create tent encampments and force people into them. But if the Supreme Court removes that barrier because they took up this Johnson versus Grants Pass case, which would kind of overturn all of this precedent, if they pave the way for that, then we have one less legal tool to be able to fight against it. And so I think that there's two things with this case. One is this case was never going to end homelessness. It does not even stop the criminalization of homelessness, and that was like the hesitation I had is cities, even in the Ninth Circuit, where this has been the law of the land for the past 5 years or so, have found numerous ways to keep doing the things that they want to be doing to force people out of public spaces, even when there isn't any adequate alternative place for them to go. And that's the caveat of all of this, is that the Constitution doesn't say you can't make it a crime to camp or sleep or sit or lie, but it says you can't enforce that law if there's no alternative place where that person can actually be. So communities are looking now, what's the lowest common denominator way of we could give somebody else a place where they could be. And so, some communities are looking at shelter, some are just looking at legalized encampments, and that's not really the outcome. We know what we want to push towards is housing. The smart communities, many communities, when they came to the Supreme Court, projected this image that, like, this case, the Martin versus Boise case, Johnson versus Grants Pass, somehow binds the hands of communities and prevents them from taking the steps that they need to take in order to end homelessness. But law enforcement is not a tool to end homelessness. And the smart communities actually see these cases as an opportunity to broaden the conversation about what does a response to homelessness look like outside of just a law enforcement response. It allows them to say to a constituent who comes in and says, I've got an encampment on my corner, I want it gone, they can just be like, well, look, the courts have told us we can't just evict that person unless there's a place for them to go. So let's work together to make that place for them to go. As opposed to just doing what they do now, which is just say, okay, let's pass a law, we'll hide the cost of it in the jail budget and the law enforcement budget, and we'll criminalize them. And so I think the hope for this case is that the Supreme Court upholds the lower court decision, and although many people are rightly pessimistic about this court, we saw a lot of room for a possible positive outcome in this case. Even Brett Kavanaugh, has done some work in a homeless shelter, and he was saying, so you arrest a person, they go to jail for 30 days, they come out, they still don't have a home. How have you helped end that person's homelessness? And that was Brett Kavanaugh. I think there's a sense that they don't want to be on the wrong side of history. We were, because we know that Trump is actively proposing these internment camps, we are framing this as potentially this court's Korematsu, a decision where, the Supreme Court back in the 1940s said it's okay to intern Japanese Americans in internment camps, and signed off on that policy. And now it's kind of been universally regretted, and we're saying, this is that the equivalent of that, because you could be authorizing the rounding up of Americans for the crime of not having a home, not being able to afford a home in a country where we know that more than half of renters can't afford their rent.
Right.
So
Speaking of renters,
yeah,
there may be some in the room who have a burning question. So, we will take your question, sir, and a question from over here, and then we'll see how much more time we have after that. When you're answering his question, if you can kind of include your closing remarks.
I wondered if you could address Governor Hochul's recent signing of the expansion of the Kendra's Law bill, which does expand the potential for the criminalization of mentally ill people by having people being locked up against their will where there is no predicate crime. And how, if the Supreme Court rules in the negative, doesn't that just create an opportunity in the state of New York to just start locking up mentally ill homeless people? Thank you.
Do you want to lawyer this one?
I can lawyer it, or folks, you got more than New York contacts, but I'll start and I'll try and keep it concise. This is the criminalization of mental illness is a parallel track that we've seen particularly in the wake of the Martin versus Boise decision, because the Eighth Amendment talks about criminal punishments, and involuntary commitments are part of the civil court system. And so there's an argument that it doesn't even get covered by the Eighth Amendment. And so we've seen a lot of communities starting to look at, well, if we can't just put people in jail, how can we get them off the streets without having to provide housing for them? And so looking at California passed this whole care court system. And these are, liberal progressive states that are just at their wits' end about how to address this homelessness crisis without actually creating more housing. And so using these misdirections to say, we're going to just invisibilize people through the involuntary commitment system. And so the court case, depending on how it goes, could have some influence on that. We have other arguments around the Americans with Disabilities Act that could still be applicable and still alive for dealing with these involuntary commitment systems. But yeah, it's really troubling that Governor Hochul, Mayor Adams, Governor Newsom out in California have all started pushing this approach, which again is not a human rights approach, not about actually helping individuals. And this is where we're really getting killed, is this whole idea that it's somehow compassionate to get somebody off of the streets and into either a jail cell or an asylum. And that's, we need to be pushing back against that. We need to be focusing on that's actually harmful, and that the thing that's going to be better for the individual and better for the entire community is housing and services.
Right, I would say to also work with the New York Civil Liberties Union, who's been pushing back against this new push with respect to Kendra's law. And I'll say that this is what happens when we have a legislature that is hell-bent on responding to media blitzes as opposed to the facts and the circumstances of what's happening here in our city.
And I would also say it really takes us back to the structural failures that have caused homelessness in the first place. Clearly, the number of people that have mental health issues on the streets of our country are a failure after deinstitutionalization. The housing that was promised after deinstitutionalization has never materialized.
Right.
That's not the fault of people who are experiencing mental health issues. It's the systemic issues that caused it in the first place and continue to perpetuate it, is all I'm saying.
Awesome. Okay,
Hi.
last question.
Hi, I'm Kristen Miller, Homeless Services United. Thank you for this very uplifting panel. But maybe to end on some action steps, if any of you have or will be putting out brief directions for us to, I love this, like shoring up from what might be coming down the way, working with our states and localities so that we can try to shift the tide a little bit.
Awesome. And since that was the last question, if everyone can answer that question, particularly talking about the state's work.
Can you mention bail reform in there too? That's applicable about shoring that up on the state levels?
Sure.
Now, that's a whole other panel.
You know, if there's anything.
Awesome.
on that.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start. If you're not already engaged with our organizations, I invite you to reach out to us, National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Other folks can say their organization's name. We all work to alert people when there's an urgent time to take action. We try not to ask you too often when it's less important, but when we reach out, it's because there's an immediate opportunity to make a difference here. And you guys are so well primed with Senator Schumer as your senator. He is a strong advocate for housing, but we do need to work on him a little bit more when it comes to making sure that the housing resources reach those who have the lowest incomes. We need to make sure that he's shored up when it comes to protecting unhoused people from these threats. But you're in a really good place to do it. And I'd also say if you're not already connected to your statewide and local advocacy efforts, that's going to be incredibly important too. Building relationships with folks in the immigration space, LGBTQ space, racial equity space. Those relationships are going to be really helpful in the future.
All right, so I don't want to repeat stuff other people are going to say, so I'll just say yes, we are working on a menu of options that people can take to do proactive things at the state level that are better than the crap that we're getting in the opposite direction, right? So we'll be coming out with that pretty soon, and there are other folks on this stage working on similar stuff, and we'll be collaborating together. Don't wait on us. You know what works. This is New York. You do not need to wait to federal partners to tell you how to do supportive housing, how to do the right thing. You know what's the right thing to do. Get it done. Write it up yourselves. We will learn from you and show other people how to do it too. And then on bail reform, I will just say, because you got way better expertise than me, it's the same argument being used to decredit bail reform, push back on harm reduction, target homeless people. Like, it's all the same movement. It's this public disorder campaign. So we got to build a bigger tent, and we got to bring these movements together. We can do better than 15 different efforts to push back on this stuff. And happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Awesome. And it also connects to Kendra's law because, you know, it was bail, it was Kendra's law, and everything else.
Yep.
Go ahead, Eric.
So if you haven't already gone to johnsonvgrantspass.com, you can go there, sign up for our mailing list, and you will get our talking points, our press releases, coming out the day of the decision that will give you memes, social media stuff that you can share, regardless of which way the decision goes. So that's where you can get the most immediate stuff. And then we are going to be rolling out a template bill if the court goes the wrong direction that could be used at the federal level, or we'll have a state level version to at least hold the line in terms of where kind of the Martin decision, the Johnson versus Grant's decision was in law. It is not enough to end homelessness on its own, but we think there's going to be a window, kind of as there was after the Dobbs decision, where states took up the charge to protect the right to abortion. If the court goes the wrong way, states can fight back with this. So go to johnsonvgrantspass.com, go to housing.handcuffs.org, follow us at Homeless Law on social media, and that's where all the most current stuff will be.
Awesome.
All right, +1, +1, +1. What I'll add is two things. One is, if you're not conferenced out and you're planning to come to the National Alliance to End Homelessness Conference next month, I hope that you'll stay and join us for Capitol Hill Day as an opportunity to talk to your legislators. And then the other thing I'll add, I forgot to mention when I was talking about the national partner work, is we are also working very closely with a lot of the states that have been targeted by those billionaires that Donald mentioned. And they're doing some really awesome stuff. Like, even though there's a lot of really bad laws that are being introduced, the majority of them are being fought down. And so we've been listening to their advocacy strategies, and the Alliance just put out some resources in the last couple of weeks, just with the tips that we've been getting from them, and we'll continue to lift up what is happening at the state and local level, because honestly, that's where we're gonna get most of this work done. So
Awesome. Donna, before you close, if you could approach the microphone so that you can actually ask your question, which is around bail reform, or whatever your commentary is. And so Donna will close, but you will be the finisher.
Ooh, nice. Well, I mean, I don't, this is on. Is it off?
Hi.
Okay. We'll
Because you got in the
reverse it.
recording? Okay. So my question was building upon what she was saying in terms of what are our next action steps? And I was just wondering, in terms of bail reform, how much that wraps into everything. And I also, just as another aside, when you were talking about the homelessness going down after a certain decriminalization stopped, and then it went back up, are there studies as well that show bail reform, how it impacts homelessness?
There's a really, one of my colleagues who used to be he was at the Department of Labor, I believe, wrote a book called The Criminalization of the Poor. I'm blanking on his name right now. Edelman?
Peter Edelman.
Peter Edelman, his book is called, and he really digs into the criminalization of poor people in general and how it ties into all these other structural issues. And I think it's a really good read. There's a lot of work in Chicago and other communities around bail reform. It really is part of the bigger issue that we need to address through structural change. That is the only way we're going to uplift people that are marginalized in this country. We have to do something about it. It causes people to become homeless. It causes them to lose jobs. It causes them to have credit issues. So there's all of us have our different platforms where we provide education, we provide action alerts on legislation. We also all have campaigns that are organizing around structural change. Ours is called the Bring America Home campaign, and it's an effort to really address those underlying structural issues that have brought us here in the first place. So I hope you'll log into one of these sites. All of us are doing good work in different ways. The National Coalition at www.nationalhomeless.org. We have a lot of information around a lot of different structural issues, but we're also working on the immediate needs of people. So there's a lot of work to do. All of these issues are absolutely tied together, and they have evolved from all kinds of structural injustices throughout history. You heard about a couple of them today. Communities are starting to address things that are in place right now that are the same things that caused us to have inequities in housing and homelessness years ago. So people have heard of zoning rights. If we could address zoning and make sure that people can build housing wherever they want to build it, regardless of the skin they're in or the economic place in this country, we could really make some substantial change. There's a lot of work to do, but act locally, think globally, There's a lot of work you can do right here in your own community. That's probably our time. That was the signal.
That was the signal. That was the signal.
But
So
very
thank
much
you.
for being
Thank you
here.
so much to our panelists. Awesome. And thank you to the Supportive Housing Network of New York for providing this opportunity. Again, I am Assemblymember Latrice Walker. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.